I'm Sabina Vaught, Director of the Kinloch Commons for Critical Pedagogy and Leadership at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to the Digital Freedom Leadership Project. This project consists of a series of brief conversations with leaders reflecting on one of their guiding principles. The project is designed as a resource to support educational leaders doing freedom work everywhere. Joining for a conversation with me today to talk about one of her leadership principles is Dr. Angelina Castagno. Dr. Castagno serves as director of the Institute for Native Serving Educators and the Dene Institute for Navajo Nation Educators at Northern Arizona University. At NAU, she is also professor of educational leadership and foundations. Angelina is president of the Council on Anthropology and Education and is executive director of Just Perspective, LLC. Her leadership, scholarly work, and teaching are dedicated to Indigenous education, equity in U.S. schools, and understanding and challenging whiteness. Angelina, thank you for joining me today as part of the Digital Freedom Leadership Project.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Sabina.
So we'll jump in. I'll start by asking you the first of the two questions I shared with you, and that is, what is one of your leadership principles? And in sharing that, if you might touch on where it came from, sort of how you learned it, maybe with whom, from whom, just sort of the general framework for that principle.
Sure. Thank you. So the principle that I'm going to talk about today is relationality. And you probably hear from everyone that it's really hard to select just one principle. But I tried to do my best and follow the instructions. And so I'm going to focus on that principle, understanding, of course, that it is connected to and tied to many other principles that I think inform my leadership work. So by relationality, in the broadest sense, we mean connectedness and a sort of sense that we are related and deeply connected to people, to space, to land, to non-human creatures and others, and that this happens across time, across space, across context. So it's sort of fluid and ever evolving, I guess, I think are some important aspects of what we mean by relationality. And it's tethered to a lot of things, but I think maybe most importantly for me, it's tethered to notions of responsibility and also justice. And so understanding that we are all deeply related and connected means we also have a deep responsibility to one another and to the spaces and the communities of which we are a part. And that responsibility for me is also deeply tied to a sense of justice. And so responsibility for sort of thinking about and stewarding and working towards, I guess, justice for the communities, the people, the spaces with whom I'm in relation. Yeah, and so I'll kind of move to like how I learned about relationality and how my ideas about it have evolved over time. So I hadn't really thought of this until you asked me the question earlier, as I was thinking about this for today, but at a fundamental level, I think I started learning about relationality from my own family, right? From very young child, from birth, maybe before birth, and sort of understanding from my mom, from my grandparents, from my uncle, what it means to be a part of a family. And that certainly, I would say, laid some important foundations in terms of how I understand relationality. but it was also a very particular understanding of relationality, and not even named that, I would say. And it was, I would say, limited in the sense that it was very much framed through like a white European immigrant experience of my grandparents, also framed through like a white working class sort of familial organization of my, my mother and my uncle and sort of my broader family. So although that certainly formed important foundations, and foundations that I would never want to, let go of or speak poorly of, I do think it was a particular orientation of relationality. So then I think as I move through life and grow in my relationships with others and my own life experiences, coming to learn more broadly about systems of power became important. Systems that do harm to certain people, that center particular people, particular ways of being. So all of that sort of, I would say, came to inform how I began understanding relationality in some different ways. In college and especially graduate school, coming to engage with critical race theory and with scholars who do that work, especially Gloria Ladson-Billings at the University of Wisconsin, and others, really brought in the justice pieces. And then engaging with Indigenous scholars, especially with Brian Brayboy, really, I would say, pushed my thinking, and also the language, or even the use of this word relationality, really for me comes out of Indigenous knowledge systems work and the work of Indigenous scholars and Indigenous thinkers. And then finally, I think most recently, I continue to sort of think about and learn what relationality means through my work with teachers, and especially Indigenous teachers, through the Dene Institute and through the broader Institute for Native Serving Educators. So they've really, and in some ways, I also hadn't thought of this until I was thinking about this for this conversation. In some ways, it has come a little bit full circle in the sense that, like, starting with my own sort of family and familial relationships, moving out to my own life experiences, my educational experiences, my work in schools, but then bringing it and sort of scholarship, right, and writing on these things, but then bringing it back to people. And that is the teachers with whom I'm with whom I work and am in community with right now. I would say have really pushed that as an important principle for how I lead in those spaces and in other spaces.
Wow, you've got me thinking about so much here. So I really love how you framed connectedness as this fundamental shaping of relationality. I think often, these words have so much meaning and context, and then they get lifted out of that and kind of circulated, and relationality is one of those. And I think you kind of brought it back to context and people and place. And so I appreciate that. And I think people listening and viewing will be able to deepen or sophisticate how they're thinking about relationality. I also love that you connected family with scholarship, with professional work. I think the constellating of all those places that get siloed, get isolated, and you wove the story of your own learning through those. So you've got me thinking, and it's exciting to think more carefully. You're always a careful thinker, and I think that's part of your relationality. So I'm appreciating the sort of carefulness of this. You finished really with kind of a perfect segue to the next prompt, which is, would you share a story about a time or a situation where you put relationality in these ways into motion or into use in your leadership work?
Yeah. Yeah. So I I can think of lots of ways, but I think I'll start maybe sort of general and then try to like hone in on like maybe something a little bit more specific. So the Dene Institute for Navajo Nation Educators, which we often call just the Dene for short, I would say really developed and has evolved with this principle sort of at its core. So the idea came from some Navajo teachers from Kayenta specifically, who came to Northern Arizona University and shared this idea that they had for a professional development institute and asked if we would work with them to sort of build it out and develop this institute in ways that were aligned with a program they had been participating with, the Yale National Initiative, but that were also more specific and more localized and more in relation to the spaces and the knowledges and the histories and the languages that are specific to this region, and even more specifically to the Navajo Nation and to the Dene people. And so I think first, just this idea of teachers, Navajo teachers, right, having an awareness and an understanding and a deep commitment to what they wanted to see and what they knew their community needed and would benefit from is part of relationality. And so for me, then being able to be a part of that, to be able to listen to what those ideas were, to learn from and with those women about what it was that they wanted to see happen and how they sort of articulated like the steps to sort of make that happen, right? Was really important. And thinking about my own positionality in that and sort of how I could engage as both as a leader, but what it means to be a leader in relationship and in relation to and with these women, this particular group of women in that case, and then later a much broader community of teachers. So that was also really important. And it comes out in some specific practices, I would say. So things like, and some of these might seem sort of technical or basic, but I think there's an important piece to like the technicality as well as like the philosophical or like epistemological pieces. So like in practice, we have things like a teacher leadership team that is not just in name, right? But that actually makes like core decisions about the direction of the Institute. And the Institute is housed at a university. And so you can imagine that knowing the history of universities, particularly vis-a-vis Indigenous communities, there are certain tendencies and sort of trajectories that sometimes try to take over the way things like this happen. But really centering the teacher leadership team and being very clear with leaders at the university, with faculty colleagues at the university, and even with leaders in the districts where the teachers work, that this group of teachers are they are the leaders of this initiative. I may have a title of director, right? But that's just a title. So that's sort of like a technical kind of piece. And then there's like languaging pieces in terms of like how we talk about teachers as leaders, teachers as professionals, and how we talk about our relationship to one another, right? And so the ways in which teachers and the rest of us introduce ourselves when we come together and understand the ways in which sometimes folks are related via clan relationships, but then also in other kinds of ways, how we are related within particular spaces and communities. Yeah, so I think those are just a couple of examples sort of big picture, both in terms of like technical pieces and then like languaging pieces. I'll end at least this part, or maybe end it completely, with like a short little like specific story. And I write about this in an article, so people can read more about it if they want to. And the teacher who is sort of the center of this story has given me permission to share this story, but not to use her name. So we call her Annika. And the short story is that she and I were on the East Coast at an Ivy League university for part of this program. And she said to me as we were walking one morning that being there to her brought back all of these memories of being in boarding schools. And we knew each other fairly well, but it struck me as a very important thing to have shared with me. And at the time, I wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. My own positionalities sometimes push me to want to do something right away. And so being reflective about that again, and what it means to be in relation with Annika and how and why she shared that. And I'll jump ahead to say that sharing of that story, and then we talked about it more in subsequent days, really pushed me to think about how to leverage my positionality and my relationships with leaders at this Ivy League institution to push back on some of the things that I was noticing and experiencing, and that others were experiencing. And so I think that's another, just like a snippet that for me really captures this notion of relationality and how it can and should inform the ways that I engage as a leader in different spaces. So.
Oh, thank you for all of those examples. I think I appreciate that you started with, what you called technical, because I think sometimes people in leadership positions can feel like, well, these lofty principles are useful for sort of big parts of the work.
Yeah.
But then there's just the tasks I have to check off. And in fact, those mundane kind of daily or regular regimented acts are the core of what we do, right? They shape everything. So I really appreciate how you described that. And I think people listening and watching will have an opportunity to transfer that to their own context. I really appreciate your example of language and thinking about, again, that seems small. How do we say something? How do we introduce? How do we start something? But it's not, there's not, scale doesn't have, I guess, doesn't carry importance. So small scale is as important as big scale. So, or we may misunderstand, that may be big scale for people.
Yeah.
And then your story, I think what I so appreciate and want to re-articulate for people is the importance of listening as action. So leaders often feel compelled to act, to do. You said that so beautifully. You felt this sort of urge or impulse, but that listening itself is a relational action, if I heard correctly, and that and that it takes time and thoughtfulness and care, and then consideration of other related actions that might carry that story or the sharing of that story forward with that responsibility you identified early in this conversation as key, being responsible to relate to people, to place as part of relationality. So I'm sure I missed big things. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that sort of summary, but I heard so many interconnected pieces there.
Yeah. I don't know that I have anything to add. I mean, this one thing that I guess strikes me that I'll just maybe add is that this A is hard work and B is never perfect work. So, one thing that I also have come to learn through my relationships and through this notion of relationality, um, especially with the teachers, is to have grace for myself and also grace with others, right, with whom I'm working. And that's not to say that we minimize our responsibilities, right, or that we're not accountable, but just to be sort of generous and loving, I guess, in a way that if we're really centering relationality and centering that connectedness, then we're gonna also understand missteps, in a different kind of way than if we aren't connected or don't center that connectedness. So, yeah.
And I wonder if, had a great dialogue, which is part of this series yesterday with Nino Testa, who talked about uncertainty and the importance of being engaged in uncertainty,
Yeah.
being dialogically engaged, pedagogically engaged in uncertainty. And I wonder a little bit if it's, relationally irresponsible or sort of antithetical to what you're saying to move with certainty, to sort of,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
hear in your stories and your examples and your summary just now that the importance of this is growth. Like this
Yes.
is always a process, not an arrival, not a place that you lock into.
Yes. Yes, for sure.
And it's
Thank
hard work. I'm glad you said that.
Yes. Yeah, especially when you get so wrapped up in like those mundane day-to-day tasks, right? Which is in part why I want to watch all of the other videos. I love this project just to sort of take that time to remind ourselves, like, what are those core principles for each of us, and to be thoughtful and intentional about continuing to center those. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Angelina. I always love being in dialogue.